Hi there, and welcome to Tales Upon the High Seas, a short story adventure series by me, Mennie. In this episode, I am reading 100 Foot Nazare and the biggest wave ever surfed. I am reading to you from the Surfers House in Portrush on the Causeway Coast on the north coast of Ireland. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy it. I was sitting outside a fish factory in a little town in Ireland called Tuam. I had received an email from a guy who had an old jet ski he wanted me to have. He felt I could do more with it than the life it currently had sat on a pallet in the back of his factory. So, I went down to collect it. Before I went, I asked him what model the ski was. I looked it up online, and it was a top-of-the-range model. A big three-seater. It was perfect. Hard to believe he was going to give it to me. He said his friend had left it behind when he moved to Australia. It was funny because it seemed to be so far-fetched that someone would email me offering me a jet ski. My mum was not convinced. She was sure it was stolen. She told me to make sure I knew where I was going and to be careful. Anyway, it wasn't stolen, but it wasn't new. It was an old first-generation jet ski. It had a pink and green stripe up the side of it for speed. It hadn't been started in a couple of years. It was about 20 years old. I was happy to take it. It was a very generous offer, a very kind and generous thought, and I even left with a side of salmon for my mum. I was pulling out of his yard when the phone rang. It was an American mobile number. I knew immediately it was Garrett McNamara, the Hawaiian big wave surfer. He phoned to say that the incoming swell was likely to be the big one. He asked if I could go and meet him there in Nazare and tackle the peak of the swell. We all knew it was a matter of time before 100-foot waves were ridden there. This was likely going to be the swell. The biggest issue may well be measuring the waves. The idea was that Garrett would ride the biggest wave. The water-based crew would be CJ, Andrew and I. We would operate alongside the land-based crew to make it happen. By then, we had walkie-talkie contact between the crew on the cliff, the beach and us on the water. It was kind of like the modern-day version of the Seven Skirts. This time, it was Garrett's manager Nicole on the radio, spotting the sets as opposed to the fishermen's wives. I explained to Garrett that I was on my way to County Clare to appear in a new advert for the Irish Tourist Board. Once I finished doing that, I would get a flight from Belfast to Lisbon for the swell. At that time, the Atlantic was flat, but the swell was brewing. I was working on a few adverts for the various departments of Irish tourism. The one I was about to feature in was about the cliffs of Moher. They didn't need to film me surfing, or it may have been that we would need to shoot when the swell arrived. Garrett told me to bring even more buoyancy aid flotation this time. He needed to borrow one of my towboard fins because he had lost his last one, so I packed a spare set. He explained to me that if we pulled this off, that there would be a lot of media coverage. I took that as meaning he had no doubt that this was the swell of a lifetime. When I put the phone down and started driving, I was thinking about what a 100-foot wave was going to look like. I had ridden waves that were 50 to 60 feet at Nazare to this point. I knew its power and energy well, but this was going to most likely be the biggest swell ever ridden in the history of surfing. I was driving out of Tuam, looking at the streetlights. I often envisage huge walls of water lined down the side of the street. Waves the size of the top of the streetlights were common at Nazare. I envisaged myself surfing them. This time, I was trying to do the same thing, but doubling the height of the streetlights. It was a crazy experience. All my life, I had been making the calls for people to come with me because there were huge waves coming here in Ireland. Other than for big wave competitions, this was the first time it had ever been the other way around, where someone was making the call for me to travel, in this case, to Portugal. I would be leaving my shores to go to another country in pursuit of the biggest waves in the world. We were only a couple of winters into pioneering Nazare, and we had what could be the biggest waves ever ridden on their way. Even for us seasoned big wave riders, that's a crazy thought. In fact, it may be a crazier thought for us than the onlookers. We know the consequences better than anyone. We know the drama, the feelings, and the emotions that can and do unfold. It was a good thing I had a couple of days filming at the Cliffs of Moher to get through. It kept my head occupied before the arrival of the swell. I got a flight down to Nazare and put in a training day in preparation for the big day. Every wave I rode, I was trying to visualize it being 3 times as big. Every time I fell and was being collected by the jet ski, I would pretend that the whitewater chasing behind was huge. I was trying to prepare myself in advance. I was thinking of all the difficult scenarios which may unfold the next morning to be one step ahead of my mind. That night, Lino, Paulo, and the rest of the team of Portuguese local men were looking after the jet skis. They were making sure everything was okay. It was incredible to have a crew of people to do this. I was often doing this myself at home. It was always my boat or jet ski, and anyone who came with me often just turned up on the day. I did all the preparation and maintenance. These guys really cared about us too. I could feel it. I often feel bad that they don't get more praise for what they do. The limelight is often taken by the surfers. There's far more to it at Nazare than the guy in the wave. Without the local Nazare families, us big wave riders would never have been able to do it. They were even trying to rig a huge rope with a handle on the end of it. If something bad happened and a fallen surfer couldn't be rescued from the sea, the rope with the handle could be of some use from a height. Serious measures were being considered ahead of what was expected to be the biggest surf ever ridden. Think about that for a minute. These sort of biggest waves ever ridden type stories mostly come from the shores of the Pacific. Sun-tanned blonde surf dudes into the mix. Here we are in the Atlantic. A Hawaiian, a Floridian, an Irishman, and an Englishman working with a team of Portuguese locals. That is unheard of. This coming together of 4 nationalities was the result of many boundaries being pushed throughout the years. The Hawaiians and Californians, without doubt, influenced me as a kid. I even had pictures cut from magazines in my room, some of which no doubt Garrett was in. That inspiration led me to pursue my own path, and to this day, it had led me to Nazare in Portugal. Like-minded people were about to take on what will no doubt be part of history. The biggest wave ever seen was going to be surfed at dawn. Coming from Ireland, I know too well that the weather forecast is unreliable. I had been fooled by it on many an occasion, but down at Nazare it was much more predictable. Even its location relative to the rest of the Atlantic was more favourable. It is often positioned south of the low pressure systems. That allows it to get hit with the big swell, but often without the wind. Ireland and many other coasts in Europe don't have that positioning. In Ireland, we often get hit by the storm and the swell at the same time. I spent that night awake, wondering and thinking about everything. I should have been sleeping, but I rarely sleep. I'm usually too anxious and running everything through my head repeatedly. There are so many factors that come to mind before big wave sessions. It's hard to get everything dealt with before bed sometimes. It leaves the mind running wild into the early hours of the morning. The morning came, and I was up before first light to get ready. The biggest waves ever ridden had not materialised. All the stress, anxiety, and commitment suddenly seemed to be nothing but overhype. Tiredness was kicking in. There were still huge waves. I was lucky enough to ride a few of the biggest waves of my life that day. Beautiful, sunny weather, far from what I was used to back home, made it even better. It appeared that the giant swell was a little later to arrive than we thought. It looked like it was going to arrive in the night or by dawn. That night, above the out-of-season, cobbled whitewashed main street of Nazare, I was lying in my bed. It was 1:30 a.m. The room was pitch black. The plastic roller shutters in the windows were closed tight. I was in a single pine-framed bed, one with a headboard and another bit of wood along its footing. I hate those beds. I am so tall at 6'5" that I usually hang my feet over the end of the bed. But that bit of wood along the end was getting in my way. I couldn't sleep. Before such a big swell, it would have been better to get some sleep. The apartment was on the second floor. There were 3 of us there, and other crew were in several other apartments in the building. It was about a mile away from the lighthouse at Praia Norte, where these huge waves break. It was also about half a mile away from the town beach on the southern side of the headland. I was tossing and turning, thinking about the morning and what I was going to face. Although I often surf huge waves, I always get anxious and unsettled beforehand. The night before can be stressful. I non-stop ponder, worry, think, examine, check all night until I eventually fall asleep, no doubt from exhausting myself. I have become a bit more relaxed about it over the years through repetition. But I still stress myself out a little at times, as I know I am never too far from a serious incident. The surfing is the obvious part. Behind the scenes, a lot of dedicated men and women were working away to make this a success. I suppose I could have relaxed a bit. I often surf alone, and so it's kind of been built into me over the years to always consider all the different elements involved, and if I have them all sorted out as best I can. I really couldn't sleep. On top of all that, the bed was doing my head in. I couldn't get comfortable, and it was starting to piss me off. Every time I moved, I noticed that the bedroom door that was closed tight would rattle a little. The bedside table too. I kept tossing and turning. Then I would be lying there, still in the darkness, and hear the door rattle and the bedside table too. It would happen for a second or two, and then back to silence. At first, I put it down to my movement causing it. Then, when I kept hearing it repeatedly every few minutes, I started to really listen hard. To my utter shock, I realised it was the waves detonating on either the shore break or the rocks at the headland. They were exploding with such force they were sending shock waves. It was causing both the bedside table and the door to tremble in the darkness of the room. Do you know when you think you heard a noise at night, and you then lie there dead still with nothing moving except your eyeballs as you try to listen? That's what I was doing. I had never experienced anything like this. I was then starting to wonder, what on earth must the surf be like if this is happening? My mind was running wild. I wasn't sure if I should be excited or terrified. This rattling was new to me. I had spent many nights in Nazare at this point, surfed some gigantic waves, and yet I had never heard this rattling. I knew that the next morning was going to be like nothing else I had ever experienced. The surfing world was about to have its eyes opened. The anticipation was off the chart. As daylight broke, swell lines stacked far out to sea. Groomed by an offshore wind, they filled the dawn view from the lighthouse at Nazare. It had arrived. We went to the harbour and got ready to go. We took jet skis from the harbour and drove northwards towards Praia Norte. Nicole, Jorge, Wilson, Paolo, and a few others watched over us from the headland. They maintained radio connection to us, giving us eyes in the back of our heads, so to speak. They would alert us or warn us of things that we may not have seen. The plan, as always, was to rotate between safety driving, surfing, towing, and keeping extra gear safe. Having more than one ski allowed us the ability to have a lot more equipment and confidence in huge seas. If something happened, we would have several chances to put it right. The day before this, Garrett had come in on the jet ski to pick me up after I rode a wave. The whitewater was huge. As we raced back out, we got caught by a big closeout right in the lip of the wave, capsized and lost the ski. I went over the falls with the wave while still on the rescue sled. It all happened so quickly, I didn't get a chance to get away from the ski and got thrown over the falls with it. Losing jet skis in big surf is unfortunately a very common thing. It is unavoidable at times. We ideally have a minimum of 2 jet skis on the water in any big tow surf session anywhere in the world. This was a luxury I never had in Ireland, especially at the beginning. On this day, as I drove towards the cliff, the one we all pondered at on the first big day, I again wondered if this may be the day that the waves as big as the cliff become reality. Waves were exploding up over the rocks that lie off the lighthouse. Those rocks are 40 feet tall, and the waves were exploding over them like they were pebbles on the beach. The surf was gigantic. Huge TP-shaped walls of water were toppling into the bay, one after another. There was no pause, and they possessed no care that anyone wanted to try and ride them. In the days before, I had been riding a new towboard. I had a nerve-wracking experience when I got to the bottom of an average-sized wave. The board I was riding slipped out from under me and lost grip on the surface, making me fall. It only happened once, but I knew it was an issue with the board design when I specifically went on left-handers. So, I had decided not to go on any left-handers for fear of falling badly. But, on this morning, the biggest waves were left-handers. I had adamantly told myself I was not going to go on left-handers, but I was not going to miss this opportunity to ride some truly huge waves. When it was my turn to surf, and I slipped into the water and got my feet into my straps, of course, a left-hander showed up. Garrett got me up in the rope and swung in towards the lighthouse. I let go of the rope and started hurtling down the face of this thing. As I dropped down the face, in my right eye, I could sense the cliff getting closer and closer. Then, the detonation of the whitewater exploded out past me. In my left eye, the large dark blue wall of water towered up above me, and in the distance, the golden sandy beach. All this information and sights coming at my senses at 1,000,000 miles an hour as I continued down the huge peak. Most of the waves at Nazare don't have a defined bottom to them. Knowing when to turn and project back up the face had become a skill. Mullaghmore, for example, is a much steeper, ledge type of wave. It allows placement of a bottom turn, whereas Nazare can require a different approach. You must get down the face far enough to gather speed, but not too far to not have enough speed to outrun the avalanche of whitewater coming behind. I rode the wave successfully and pulled out over the shoulder, and Garrett came to get me. The surf wasn't as giant as we had hoped. The wave I surfed was big, and it felt great, but it wasn't the 100-footers expected. However, there was a distinct higher level of energy in the water this morning. It felt alive more than normal. Garrett decided he was going to go on a wave and slipped into the water. I rotated onto the safety ski and drove a little further inside towards the headland. It gave me a better vantage point to watch over him. As if it was meant to be, 3 huge peaks appeared within minutes of him slipping into the water. I positioned myself as best as I could to watch as he was driven into their path, letting go of the rope. He headed down into the centre of one of the incredible blue peaks. I will never forget the sight. He leaned forward on his board and charged straight down the unbroken mountain of water. He charged straight to the bottom of the peak. I was sure this was the biggest wave ever ridden. It was ridiculous. The thing was like a hillside moving through the water. It toppled and sent a massive avalanche of whitewater down after him. He outran it and successfully rode the beast. It was an incredible sight. Strangely, those 3 waves were the only ones of that size that came through all morning. It was his day. It was meant to be. I was in no doubt that Garrett had accomplished what he went there to do. We arrived back to the harbour. It was clear from the applause and crowd gathering that the wave he rode was the biggest ever surfed. I saw the pictures later that day that local Portuguese photographer Wilson Ribeiro had taken. It was mind-blowing. I wrote an article on my website at the time that went viral. I told this story and the experience from my point of view. Before long, media channels from all over the globe were on the story, and the wave was measured by various people as anywhere from 70 feet to 104 feet. No one could agree on its exact size. I reckon I had the best vantage point, and I estimated it to be 90 feet. It was headline news in almost every country and resulted in a Guinness World Record. When footage and images of the wave Garrett Road were beamed around the world, they were met with a mixed response. Despite being undeniably gigantic, lots of the usual keyboard warriors and naysayers stuck their oar in, some calling it 30 foot, etc. However, the mainstream thought it was amazing, as did the general public. Garrett got a lot of attention and it raised his profile. A lot of people took issue with the waves at Nazare. Lots of famous big wave surfers from around the world did not like what they saw. They immediately tried to diss it. The hype and controversy around Nazare grew over the years to come. More big swells, more naysayers, and more supporters. Lots of big wave riders travelled there. Some tried to paddle, some successfully, some not so. Some surfers, who could barely stand to be honest, turned up looking for fame and glory on all sorts of craft. This new big wave phenomenon had reached far beyond the realms of the surf world, like never before. Next, the keyboard warriors started slating the tow scene. All over the world, people's attention turned to paddling, even at Nazare for a while, despite the fact that these waves were supersized and the risk factors far outweigh paddling on most of the big days. It was a strange time. However, in saying that, there have been some gigantic waves paddled into at Nazare. Garrett also broke the seal on that too, very early on. Eventually, tow surfing became cool again. Surfers from all over the globe now base themselves in Nazare and ride gigantic waves a lot. Lots of the naysayers have now become regulars too. Without doubt, some of the biggest waves in the world have been ridden at Nazare by some of the best in the sport. I remember going back to Nazare a few months after the world record. I saw a gigantic billboard on the way out of town on the roadside with Garrett's wave on it. It was Wilson's photograph. The locals were proud. Their vision and hard work had become reality. And that was only the beginning. Since then, there have been several world record waves ridden at Nazare. Praia Norte is now the leading big wave location on the planet. Almost every swell is very crowded, with highly funded teams from all over the world trying to get a slice of the pie. The headland is now packed with tourists and spectators. Traffic jams and no parking is common on big swells. Whole teams of big wave riders are camped out in Nazare all season now. Some all year round waiting and practicing for the day they may be the one that rides the biggest wave in the world. One of the local men, Pedro Pisco, recently posted to his Facebook page an old poster from the North Canyon show from 2010, the project that started all of this. The North Canyon show produced a series of films and media and funded the whole creation of Nazare, the big wave spot. Pedro wrote his post in both Portuguese and English, and he detailed who he considered as the original crew at Nazare. I have duplicated his list here. English version. On the 22nd of November 2019, Pedro Pisco posted on Facebook. The report of the first year of the project of the giant waves of Praia do Norte. A project done in Nazare Qualifica by people of Nazare and others with Nazare in Coração. A huge hug to those, in my opinion, made a history and provided a very important vehicle for Nazare. Because nobody does anything alone, here's the first team from the North Canyon. Pedro Pisco, Nazare Project Management. Paulo Lopes, Villanova de Guia, Conception and Coordination. Paulo Salvador, Nazare, Logistica and Security. Dino Casimiro Nazare, predictions, scientist of the waves. Garrett McNamara, USA. Nicole Macias, McNamara, USA. Jorge Leal Villanova de Guia, videomaker, director of photography. Guti Martin, Spain, logistics. Wilson Ribeiro, Big Navy photographer. Maria Jaulete, Porto, communication. The Surfers. Garrett McNamara, USA. Jose Gregorio, Portugal. Peo Lizarazu, France. Cotton Socks, England. Al Mennie, Northern Ireland. Ruben Gonzalez, Portugal. The locals then took possession of the closed lighthouse on the headland. They turned it into a shrine, so to speak, a museum, a hall of fame. They invited the significant players in the development of Nazare as the location to ride the biggest waves on earth, to hang a surfboard and a plaque on the wall there. I was invited to do so by the CEO of Praia de Norte, Carlos Felipe, in May 2018. I travelled there with the board that I rode on the record-breaking day. I met the new mayor, Walter Chicaro, and Carlos Felipe. They had a little ceremony for me, where we spoke to a small crowd of people. Fame and glory, and not to mention money, came to the world of big wave surfing with the development of Nazare. Some riders had deals never seen before in surfing. Others had nothing, but were still out there charging the giant waves. The empty lockups at the harbour are now clad in logos and marketing material. Several big brands have taken permanent residence there. I feel very fortunate to have been involved in so many elements of the big wave world in the early stages. That's where my passion lies. The unknown, the breaking of new ground. Nazare has now become vitally important to big wave surfing, and it has become very popular with surfers. It is very much in the limelight at the moment. The numbers of people pursuing big wave surfing around the world has jumped dramatically, in particular since the rise of social media, giving people almost instant access to things they would never have seen before without being directly involved. The rise of Nazare has without doubt contributed to more people's desire to become big wave riders. Since I was a kid, Portugal has always been a special place for me. I used to be in awe of the big fort at Sagres and stories of Columbus sailing there. I loved standing on the cliffs on the southern side of the tip and seeing the gigantic seas roll past on the horizon to the west. There's an end to the world feel about some of the headlands in Portugal, something I also find in Ireland. It is without doubt the country I have returned to the most, and is somewhere I could see myself living. For now though, it was time for me to get back to riding storms off the west coast of Ireland. The end. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tales Upon the High Seas. The story was written and the audio performed by me, Al Mennie, at the Surfers House in Portrush on the Causeway Coast, Ireland. The audio was mastered and mixed by Miguel, Oliveira in Porto, Portugal. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.